The deal went down in broad daylight, September 14, 1858, outside the Anderson County Courthouse in Palestine, Texas. James Henry Garrett, a respected cotton planter with ambition running deeper than his pockets, handed over his wife, Delilah May Garrett, a woman whose body had grown to 347 pounds, to a horse dealer named Silas Beaumont. In exchange, Garrett took possession of a purebred Morgan stallion worth $600. Dozens of witnesses stood frozen, watching as two men signed papers to make it official. The wife stood beside them, expression blank, as if she'd already left herself behind somewhere years ago. The crowd expected scandal. They didn't yet realize they were watching the start of a revenge that would wreck lives, burn fortunes, and stain Texas history in blood and smoke. Palestine in 1858 wasn't some dusty outpost. It was a growing town of 2,000 fed by cotton, timber, and pride. Main Street boasted brick buildings, 2 banks, and a courthouse built from imported limestone. The kind of place where names meant everything, where reputation was wealth and gossip carried more power than law. Among the town's upper crust stood the Garretts. James Henry Garrett had inherited 400 acres of rich bottomland, 12 enslaved workers, and a solid Greek revival home that looked like a planter's dream. By 34, he'd built it into 600 acres and nearly doubled his labor force. He dressed sharp, went to church every Sunday, and held office as treasurer of the Agricultural Association. Outwardly, he had everything a man could want in the mid-19th century South, except satisfaction. His wife, Delilah May, had once been the pride of a merchant family in Crockett. When they married in 1851, people called them handsome together, though she already carried more weight than fashion approved. She could read French, play piano, and manage a home as well as any woman in the county. But tragedy and grief had a way of expanding her body as much as it shrank her world. 2 years into the marriage, twin stillbirths crushed her spirit. She retreated indoors, surrounded by servants who brought her trays of rich food and gossip she pretended not to hear. By 1858, she rarely left the house. Her husband's frustration grew louder with every glass of bourbon. To his friends, he complained about the burden he bore. No sons, no status, no pleasure, just a wife who ate too much and moved too little. For James Garrett, Delilah had become a symbol of everything that kept him from climbing higher in society. To the town, her weight wasn't just her shame, it was his. Enter Silas Beaumont. He was everything Garrett wasn't. A tall, rangy man from Kentucky with hands calloused from reins, not ledgers. He made his living buying, breeding, and trading horses across Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. A man who spent more time on the road than in any parlor, and whose reputation rested on the sharpness of his eye and the steadiness of his word. People said Beaumont could spot a horse's bloodline from across a corral, and train the meanest stallion into obedience without ever raising his voice. His farm lay 5 miles west of town, a clean barn, a small cabin, and a few hired hands. It was a working place, not a social one, and while most men in Anderson County respected his trade, few truly welcomed him at their tables. He wasn't their kind, and he didn't pretend to be. 3 months before the courthouse scene, Beaumont had sold James Garrett a young gelding. The horse looked perfect until the split hoof showed itself after purchase. Garrett claimed deception. Beaumont claimed ignorance. When the trader returned from Arkansas weeks later, Garrett had already spread word that Beaumont was a cheat. That rumor cut deeper than Garrett could have known. In a county built on reputation, a horse trader's word was his entire business. Their next meeting, at the Agricultural Association's summer gathering, sparked a confrontation people would still whisper about years later. Surrounded by other planters, Garrett demanded repayment. Beaumont, standing alone, met his challenge with quiet contempt. Garrett threw him off the property with a public insult, and Beaumont left wearing a smile that unsettled everyone who saw it. When Garrett demanded satisfaction, Beaumont simply told him he'd named the terms. It was the kind of thing men said in anger, but Beaumont took it literally. And over the next 2 months, he studied his enemy the way a hunter studies a wounded animal, patiently, coldly, and with purpose. He started asking questions, casual ones at first. He spoke with Garrett's house servants at market, paid a polite visit to the Thornton family in Crockett under the pretense of horse trading, sat quietly in the back row of the Methodist church where the Garretts worshipped, observing how people whispered when Delilah's name came up. What he learned was enough to design a kind of vengeance no pistol duel could match. He saw that Garrett's pride was built entirely on how others viewed him, and that his wife's existence was the crack in that foundation. So Beaumont did something no one in Anderson County would have imagined. On the morning of September 10th, he arrived at the Garrett plantation riding a magnificent Morgan stallion, a deep mahogany coat that shimmered almost black in the Texas sun. The animal's strength and pedigree drew James Garrett from his porch immediately. He couldn't help but admire it. Beaumont sat in the saddle, calm as a man who already knew the outcome of the conversation. Garrett admired the horse, asked its price, already knowing it would be more than he could afford. Beaumont told him he wasn't selling. He was offering a trade. At first, Garrett laughed. There was nothing on his property worth that stallion. But Beaumont said that depended on perspective. Then he named his terms. He would trade the horse for James Garrett's wife. The words landed like a thunderclap. Garrett's face cycled from outrage to disbelief to something colder, consideration. He'd been dared before, insulted before, but this proposal didn't sound like madness to a man who saw his wife as a liability. It sounded like opportunity dressed in scandal. Beaumont laid out the logic clearly, almost clinically. A marriage, after all, was a kind of contract, one that could be dissolved if both parties agreed. Dowries were financial transactions, why not a different kind of exchange? With proper paperwork and a judge willing to notarize, the law could accommodate what society never would. Garrett paced the porch while Beaumont waited patient as stone. Finally, Garrett asked what such an arrangement would look like on paper. Beaumont was ready. He already had the documents drafted, with Judge Patterson's review and assurances of legality, if everyone signed freely. The following 4 days turned Palestine, Texas into a furnace of gossip. By September 14th, half the county had heard whispers that something unholy was about to happen at the courthouse. That morning dawned bright and hot. By 10 o'clock, a crowd gathered, pretending to mind their business but staying to witness the unimaginable. Garrett arrived in his carriage, his wife beside him, her face unreadable. Beaumont stood waiting with the stallion, holding a leather case that contained his vengeance. When the papers were signed, when Garrett walked away leading the Morgan stallion, and Beaumont drove west with Delilah May Garrett seated beside him, Anderson County fell silent. What no one knew yet was that the transaction was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The road from destination to Beaumont's property stretched 5 miles, but to Delilah May it might as well have been 500. She sat beside the horse trader in the wagon, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the familiar countryside pass in silence. Cotton fields shimmered white under the midday sun. She recognized them all, farms she'd driven by countless times. But everything looked different now. She was no longer a planter's wife on a polite outing. She was something unclassified, unimagined, a woman traded like stock and yet suddenly, terrifyingly, free. Beaumont didn't speak during the ride. His eyes stayed on the road, his grip steady on the reins. The silence felt less like neglect and more like respect. an acknowledgement that words would only cheapen what had just happened. For the first time in years, no one was telling Delilah what to do, what to eat, or how to behave. She was simply moving forward into whatever this strange new life would become. When they reached the property, she saw at once that it reflected the man who owned it. Spare, practical, self-contained. The house was small, built from timber darkened by weather, a single story and a half with a deep porch shaded by vines. But the barn dominated the land. Freshly painted, large, well-kept. Fences straight as if measured by a rifle sight. Horses grazed in tidy paddocks, their coats gleaming. 3 men were working near the corral, and one older man stood on the porch waiting. He was gray-haired, with skin the color of dark cedar and the posture of someone who'd earned his dignity one hard year at a time. "Abraham," Beaumont said, climbing down. "This is Mrs. Garrett. She'll be running the household from now on." The old man inclined his head slightly. "Yes, sir." Then to Delilah May, his tone even, "This way, ma'am." Inside, the house was smaller than she expected, but spotless. One large main room that served as kitchen, dining space, and sitting area. 2 smaller rooms branched off. One clearly Beaumont's bedroom, the other a cramped store space converted into a second sleeping area. Everything had a practical order. The table scrubbed white, the stove clean, tools hung neatly on the wall. It wasn't a home meant to impress. It was a place meant to function. "Mr. Beaumont's gone most weeks," Abraham said as he showed her around. "He keeps things simple because he's rarely here. I do the cooking, but there's too much work for one person to keep up proper." Delilah nodded, already noting what needed doing. The shelves needed rearranging. The floorboards near the window needed sealing before winter. The bedding could be laundered and mended. After years trapped in a parlor, the sheer possibility of purposeful work felt like oxygen. She asked Abraham about supplies, about the ledgers, about where correspondence was kept. The questions came naturally, like muscles waking from long sleep. When Beaumont returned that evening after tending to the horses, he found her at the kitchen table surrounded by ledgers and scattered papers. The lamp cast a warm glow over her face, making her look different, focused, alive. "You work quickly," he said, taking the chair across from her. "You have invoices from last year that never balanced," she replied without glancing up. "Your feed supply has been overcharging by at least 15%, and there are missing entries for your Louisiana sales." He leaned back, studying her with quiet satisfaction. "I knew you'd be useful." She finally met his eyes. "We need to be clear about our arrangement. What happened in that courthouse may be legal, but it's not normal. I want to know exactly what's expected of me and what isn't." They talked for hours. No contracts, no ceremony, just plain terms. She would manage the household, keep financial records, handle correspondence, oversee supplies, and maintain the order he'd never had time to establish. In return, she'd have control over her own work, an allowance for her needs, and the understanding that her position was administrative, not domestic. The custody papers might call her his responsibility, but they both agreed she was no one's property. When their discussion ended, Delilah felt something she hadn't known in years. Clarity. The walls of her marriage had kept her fed and clothed, but dead inside. Here, in this rough cabin with its faint smell of hay and leather, she could finally breathe. The days that followed unfolded with the rhythm she set herself. Mornings began before sunrise, with Abraham preparing coffee while she reviewed the day's work. She catalogued supplies, reconciled ledgers, organized correspondence into labeled stacks. She learned the stable hands' routines, Curtis and Martin Yarrow, brothers who'd worked for Beaumont for years. They eyed her warily at first, unsure what kind of woman stepped off a courthouse wagon after being traded like cattle. But soon they saw how her changes made their own work easier. Meals were on time. Equipment was maintained. Bills got paid. The place started running like a machine. The transformation extended to her, too. The work demanded motion, climbing stairs, hauling water, scrubbing, walking the paddocks to count the horses. Her meals were simple and regular, not the endless trays of rich food she'd once consumed in silence. Weight slipped away quietly, replaced by a kind of strength she hadn't known she possessed. For the first time since her youth, she saw her reflection without flinching. Abraham became her ally in efficiency. He had once been enslaved in Kentucky, freed long before the Garrett's rise, and had learned how to survive in a world ruled by men who saw others as tools. With a steady hand and a patient tone, he helped her understand the unwritten codes of Anderson County, the alliances, the rivalries, the ways information traveled faster than truth. By October, the Beaumont property no longer looked like a trader's way station. It looked like a small empire in the making. Horses fed and groomed on schedule, ledgers balanced to the penny. Even the meals had become something approaching civilized. Recipes from her mother's cookbook transformed the coarse ingredients of frontier life into nourishment that drew compliments from the men. When Beaumont returned from a trading trip to Louisiana, he found a house humming with efficiency. The ledgers were organized. The correspondence was answered. The operation was running itself. She handed him a written summary of profits and expenditures, something he'd never seen before from anyone on his payroll. "You've done more in a month than I managed." "In 3 years," he said, "you gave me work worth doing," she replied. "What began as a trade between a man's spite and another man's pride was becoming something neither of them expected, a partnership." Back in Palestine, tongues still wagged. No one could quite categorize what had happened. Some called it sin. Others whispered that Garrett had rid himself of a burden and Beaumont had taken pity. The courthouse transaction faded from public conversation, but never from memory. Garrett, meanwhile, appeared at agricultural meetings flaunting the Morgan stallion like a prize won in a contest no one wanted to discuss. He smiled more now, drank more too. The horse was beautiful, but it also reminded everyone how cheaply he'd valued his wife. Delilah May's family in Crockett received her letter in early November. She'd written it carefully, describing her new life in neutral terms, managing a household for a trader, assisting with accounts, helping the business grow. Her parents chose to believe it was respectable employment, not scandal. They wrote back with stiff politeness and did not mention her husband. By winter's approach, the whispers around town had grown faint. People in Palestine had new distractions: politics, cotton, and talk of tensions rising in faraway Kansas. But out west of town, something real was taking root. Delilah May had not only survived her exchange, she was thriving. The household ran smoother than ever, profits climbed, and even the hands began to speak of her with respect. Curtis once muttered to his brother that the boss might be the horse trader, but the place truly belonged to the lady inside. And when Beaumont returned from another trip before Christmas, Delilah was ready with something that would change everything again. She'd spent weeks studying breeding records, tracing bloodlines and comparing prices across states. She'd identified an opportunity, a sale of 3 mares from Lexington, Kentucky, with pedigrees that could elevate Beaumont's entire operation from trader to breeder. When she laid the papers before him, her excitement showed in every line of her face. "This could make you more than a horse dealer," she said. "It could make you a name." He looked through her notes, the precision of her research, the logic in her estimates. Then he looked at her. "You're thinking bigger than I've ever dared." She smiled slightly. "That's because I've watched a man think small my entire marriage." Beaumont approved the purchase. Neither of them realized that the decision would ignite the next chapter of a vengeance neither could control. Winter came down on Anderson County that year, clear and sharp. The kind of season that thinned the air and laid bare every crack in a man's pride. By January of 1859, the Beaumont property had become something the locals could no longer dismiss as scandal. It was success, and success makes even the pious curious. The Kentucky mares arrived in mid-month, 3 of them, shipped by rail to Tyler and hauled the last miles by wagon. They were everything Delilah May had promised: fine-boned, strong-chested, perfect tempers, deep bloodlines. Beaumont examined them one by one in the frosty light, nodding approval with the precision of a craftsman checking his tools. The Yarrows grinned. Abraham whistled low. Even the horses seemed to sense they'd entered a place that meant to make use of them. That night, in the warm glow of the kitchen lamp, Beaumont poured whiskey into 2 tin cups and handed one to Delilah. "You just changed the future of this farm," he said. She took the cup but didn't drink. "Then let's make it count." The next weeks felt like a miracle stitched together by work. Letters went out to breeders and buyers across the South. Curtis tracked feed and stable schedules. Martin charted breeding lines. Delilah turned raw data into plans. She'd built ledgers so clean they could have been published. Each night she closed them, tucked the pencil behind her ear, and for a few moments watched the fire burn without thinking of her old life at all. In town, the whispers changed tone. No longer scandalous, the story had turned enviable. A woman traded for a horse had become indispensable to the man who'd bartered for her. Folks told the story differently now, each retelling trimming the shame and sharpening the legend. But James Garrett heard every version, and each one dug a little deeper into him. He rode the Morgan stallion around Palestine like a king showing off his crown jewel, but the horse reminded everyone of the bargain behind it. Every time the animal's hooves hit the dirt, it was as if they struck the drumbeat of his humiliation. At first, he tried to drown it out with bourbon and louder laughter. Then he tried silence. Neither worked. By February, he could no longer ignore what the county was saying, that the woman he'd called useless was running a thriving business while he basked in borrowed glory. So one morning, without sending word, he mounted the Morgan and rode west. Delilah was at the kitchen table when she heard the hooves. She didn't need to look to know whose they were. She stood, straightened her dress, and stepped onto the porch. James Garrett dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning her with something close to disbelief. The woman before him was smaller, sharper, the glow of purpose changing her posture entirely. "I want to discuss our agreement," he began. "There's nothing to discuss." "I'll pay him double," Garrett said, jaw tightening. "Whatever he got for the horse, I'll return twice over to reverse the deal." "I'm not a horse, James. You're under his custody." "That means you're negotiable." She met his eyes until his confidence flickered. "No, I chose this. I'm not coming back." For a heartbeat he said nothing. Then his face hardened, and he mounted again. "You'll regret this," he muttered, before spurring the stallion toward the road. Curtis Yarrow had watched from the barn. When Beaumont returned that evening, the news didn't surprise him. "He'll be back," he said quietly. "Men like that can't stand losing the story as well as the fight." He was right. Garrett's next move wasn't a visit. It was poison in words. All spring he seeded the county with gossip. Quiet suggestions that Beaumont's new mares were overbred, that his debts outpaced his income, that the fine lady running his books was less bookkeeper than mistress. It was the kind of campaign that required no evidence, only repetition. Business faltered. Buyers hesitated. Beaumont's jaw set harder each week, but Delilah had learned how such wars were won. "We answer with proof," she told him. Results louder than rumor, so they waited for the foaling. The first came June 3rd. A filly dark as polished walnut, legs strong, head proud. Curtis declared her perfect. 2 weeks later came a colt equally fine. By the time the third mare birthed twins in July, an almost unheard-of rarity, the entire county was whispering again, this time in admiration. Quality doesn't gossip. It declares itself. Delilah's letters went north and east to breeders and traders she'd never met. Word spread fast. Suddenly, the same people who'd snickered at the courthouse trade were offering contracts. Money began flowing back, but prosperity has its own kind of danger. One evening, a courier brought her a letter from Crockett, her father's handwriting tight and cold. He'd heard about the courthouse affair from James himself. The family demanded she return home at once to discuss her future. She read it twice, feeling the snare close. Refuse and she'd appear a captive. Obey and they'd smother her back into silence. She showed the letter to Beaumont, who read it and simply said, "Your choice." So she made one. She wrote back, explaining the truth, her confinement in that house, the humiliation, the emptiness. She described her work, her independence, the partnership she'd built. "I will not return," she wrote, "because I am no longer the woman who left." 2 weeks later, her father replied with finality. The family disowned her. No support, no acknowledgement, no inheritance. She wept for 15 minutes, then folded the letter away and went back to work. By late summer, Beaumont's operation was thriving again. The twins became a sensation. Breeders came from as far as Louisiana to see them. The stables hummed with life, and the yard rang with hammer and hoof. Success had erased the scandal, or so they thought, because success to James Garrett was the deepest insult yet. In September he came once more, this time with papers in hand, formal documents offering $3,000 to reverse the original arrangement. Beaumont met him in the yard, coatless, the dust of labor still on his hands. Delilah watched from the porch, silent. Beaumont read the proposal, then handed it back. "No interest. That's more than this place is worth," Garrett snapped. "Maybe to you," Beaumont replied. Garrett's voice rose. "She's my wife." "She was," Beaumont said evenly. "Now she's free. The law settled that." Garrett's gaze flicked toward the porch. "You'd rather work like a servant than live as a lady?" he demanded. Delilah answered quietly, "I'd rather live with purpose than die in silk." For a long moment, Garrett just stared. Then his expression turned to stone. "You'll both regret this," he said. And he rode off into the dusk. Afterward, the farm seemed to exhale, but only briefly. They all felt the shift in the air, like static before a storm. Weeks passed. Then Abraham returned one night from market, troubled. He'd spoken to one of Garrett's enslaved men, who whispered a warning. James was meeting with strangers from Tyler. Rough men. He'd been asking when Beaumont traveled, when the house was empty. Garrett wasn't coming back to talk. For days, Beaumont altered his routines, slept in the barn, kept a rifle close. Nothing happened. September turned to October, the air cooler, the threat starting to feel like imagination, until the night of the 23rd. Delilah woke to pounding on her door and Abraham's voice yelling fire. She ran outside barefoot, the sky orange. The barn, everything they'd built, was engulfed. Horses screamed inside. Curtis and Martin fought the doors, pulling what animals they could. Smoke clawed her throat. Heat blistered her face. Through the haze she glimpsed movement, 3 riders on the ridge, silhouettes against the firelight, watching. The roof collapsed. The flames roared louder. By dawn the barn was ash, 2 mares and a foal burned alive, and half the year's work turned to smoke drifting over the fields. When Beaumont returned from Arkansas 2 days later and saw the ruins, he didn't speak for a long time. His face was carved stone. Then he said only, he hired it done. There was no proof, and the sheriff wasn't interested in looking. In 1859 Texas, arson against a horse trader wasn't a priority, especially when the suspected man was a planter with money and name, so they did what they always had. They rebuilt. But the fire wasn't just destruction. It was message. James Garrett's way of declaring that he still owned the power to ruin them. and as the smoke faded into the cold blue of November, everyone on that property knew the next act of this feud would not be fought with words or contracts, but with something darker. The ruins of the barn smoldered for days. Black ash clung to the fence rails like a bruise that wouldn't fade. When the embers finally went cold, the place felt hollow, emptied not only of horses but of safety. The smell of charred timber and hair clung to everything. Every step across the yard stirred memories Delilah didn't want but couldn't shake. They buried the remains of the mares behind the paddock fence, 3 mounds marked by rough wooden stakes. Curtis said a prayer in his quiet country way. Abraham stood beside him, hat in hand, and Beaumont watched in silence, his jaw tight, the air around him heavy with calculation. He said nothing about vengeance, but everyone could feel it coiling beneath his calm. Then, as if the fire hadn't already taken enough, the next blow came not from flame but from paper. 2 weeks after the fire, the Anderson County Sheriff rode up with a deputy and a folded warrant. Fraud filed by James Garrett himself. The charge claimed Beaumont had deceived both the court and Delilah May in the 1858 transaction, coercing her into signing away her marriage under false pretenses for his own profit. The hearing was set for 2 days later. Judge Patterson would preside. The irony bit deep. The same judge who had notarized the original exchange now had to decide whether it was a crime. "This is his next move," Beaumont said, reading the warrant at the kitchen table. "He burns what he can't take, and when that fails, he hides behind law." Delilah looked at the paper, feeling the trap tighten. "He'll try to make me helpless again." The poor, confused woman who couldn't possibly understand what she signed. "If the court believes that, you'll be ruined, and I'll belong to no one, not even myself." They both knew how the county worked. The law was elastic for men with names carved on courthouse stones. But there was no choice. They would have to face it. The courthouse was full the morning of the hearing. Farmers, merchants, wives, everyone hungry to watch another chapter of the scandal unfold. Garrett had arrived in full planter's finery, with a lawyer from Tyler named Fulton, a smooth man whose voice carried like a sermon. Beaumont and Delilah came alone. No counsel, no allies. Only Abraham sitting in the back, arms crossed, silent support carved from loyalty. Judge Patterson's face was drawn and pale. He looked like a man wishing himself elsewhere, but the proceedings began. Fulton spun his story with the precision of a knife. He spoke of a vulnerable woman broken by loss, confined by shame, preyed upon by a cunning trader who saw profit in her despair. He painted Beaumont as a predator and Delilah as a victim too humiliated to resist. Garrett sat beside him, solemn, wounded, the image of a wronged gentleman protecting his family's name. When Beaumont stood to respond, there was no lawyer to polish his words. He spoke as plainly as he lived. "She signed those papers in this very room, before this very judge, by her own will. No one forced her. And since that day she's run my business better than I ever did." Does that sound like a woman too weak to decide for herself? He gestured toward Delilah. "If there's been deceit here, it's not mine. It's the man who can't stand that the wife he cast aside found purpose without him." Fulton objected. "Of course." But the crowd had already shifted. Some whispered, some nodded. The tide of sympathy was moving. Judge Patterson called Delilah to the stand. She rose, walked with deliberate steadiness, and faced the court. She looked nothing like the gossip's version of her, no longer soft or meek. Her figure had changed, her eyes sharp, her voice clear. "Mrs. Garrett," the judge began, "were you coerced into that exchange?" "No," she said simply. "I agreed to it. Did you understand its meaning?" "Completely. It dissolved a marriage that had become a prison and gave me the right to work, to think, to live. Mr. Beaumont offered me a choice my husband never did. Usefulness. Fulton tried to rattle her. He asked about her mental state, her grief, her isolation. Each time she answered plainly, turning the words back on him. You call it isolation. I call it confinement. You call it weakness. I call it hunger for something more. By the time she stepped down, the air in the room had changed. Even those who came for gossip found themselves caught in the gravity of her poise. Judge Patterson recessed the court, promising a ruling within days. But everyone already sensed the verdict's shape. Back at the farm, the waiting gnawed. Each sunrise felt like a held breath that wouldn't release. On the 8th day, the courier arrived with a sealed envelope. Beaumont read the decision first, then passed it to her. The ruling was technical, careful, crafted to offend no one too deeply. Patterson declared that no coercion had occurred. The parties had signed freely, in full understanding. Yet he called the custody language improper under Texas marriage law. He dissolved that clause while upholding the dissolution of marriage. In the eyes of the state, Delilah May was no longer anyone's wife nor anyone's charge. A free woman, legally independent, but the arrangement that had shielded them from scrutiny was gone. James Garrett lost his fraud claim, but he'd succeeded in piercing their structure. The judge's pen had stripped away the strange protection that made their situation untouchable. Now everything was exposed again. 3 nights later, Curtis found the poisoned mares. They were sprawled near the fence, foam drying on their lips, feed buckets still half full. The other horses were untouched. Whoever had done it knew exactly what to target. Curtis called them quietly, hands trembling as he checked each body. 2 pregnant mares gone, a third gasping through her final breaths. Delilah knelt beside the dying animal, stroking its neck as the life went out of it. The smell of bitter chemicals stung her nose. She looked up at Beaumont, who stood at the fence line, fists clenched, face unreadable. He won't stop, he said. Not till he's taken everything or we're dead. Then we finish it, Delilah replied. Her voice carried no tremor, only decision. Because the law never will. Inside the house that night, with the lantern light catching the angles of her face, she laid out what she'd never told anyone. 7 years of a marriage had given her more than pain. It had given her knowledge. She knew Garrett's books, his debts, the quiet trades he'd made behind closed doors. And she knew his biggest secret. During their marriage, she'd stumbled across records of slave purchases from Louisiana, names, ages, dates, all years after the African trade was outlawed. Smuggled men and women bought illegally through intermediaries, proof enough to destroy him. She'd kept copies, hidden away, first as protection, later out of instinct. Now that instinct turned into a weapon. I can ruin him, she said. Not his fields, not his money. His name. Beaumont looked at her, seeing for the first time the cold steel she'd forged from humiliation. You'd go that far? He burned my life once, she answered. And he's burning it again. Yes, I'll go that far. They debated until dawn. To expose him publicly meant scandal that would scorch them both. But to threaten exposure, that might be enough. By sunrise, they had their plan. She drafted a letter with the precision of a blade. It listed the dates of Garrett's illegal purchases, the names of traders, the sums paid, and the laws violated. At the end, a single promise. If any further harm came to her or to Beaumont's property, the records would go straight to the federal marshal in Tyler and to every newspaper in East Texas. Curtis delivered it by hand. Garrett read it on his porch, and his face, according to Curtis, went gray as ash. He folded the paper, looked up once, and said only, "Tell them I understand." And for the first time in nearly 2 years, silence fell. No fire. No sabotage. No legal tricks. Just quiet. Too quiet. They rebuilt again. Bought new stock. Repaired fences. Worked until their muscles forgot fear. Weeks turned into months, and life began to resemble something like peace. But peace in Anderson County never came without a price. Every dawn carried the question neither of them dared voice. When would the silence break? Spring returned to Anderson County in 1860 as if the land had forgotten. The grass came back green over the scorched paddock. Wildflowers pushed through the ash, and the smell of new hay replaced the smoke that had haunted the place for months. To the casual eye, the Beaumont farm looked whole again. Barn rebuilt, fences straight, horses healthy. But for those who'd lived through the ruin, every sound of hammer or hoof carried a memory of fire. Delilah May woke each morning before light and walked the perimeter herself, watching mist rise over the fields. She'd learned to read silence, the shift of birds when someone was near, the hush of wind that sometimes sounded like breath. Nothing moved on that land without her noticing. The letter she'd sent to Garrett had worked better than they'd dared hope. The man had vanished from town gossip. He rarely left his estate now, kept to his fields, dismissed servants who asked questions. People said he'd taken sick, though no doctor ever confirmed it. When someone mentioned his name, it came in a whisper. The story of the horse trade had curdled into something darker, something people avoided speaking of at all, as if the memory itself could summon bad luck. For a time, peace meant work. The new foals thrived. The Kentucky bloodlines bore fruit in sleek, strong colts that carried Beaumont's brand across the county. Buyers came from Galveston, Shreveport, even Memphis, all eager to see the horses bred by the woman once traded for one. They left impressed, checks signed, rumors shifting from scandal to awe. Delilah didn't bask in the talk. She worked harder. Her hands, once soft and unused, had calluses now, the marks of someone who built her own name. She still kept the old records locked in a chest by her desk. Garrett's ledgers, the proof of his crimes, sealed but never forgotten. Power, she'd learned, was safety only when guarded. By summer, Beaumont's farm was turning profit enough to consider expansion. They spoke of buying the adjacent tract, land Garrett himself had once owned before debts forced its sale. Poetic, Beaumont called it with a half-smile. Delilah only said, "Dangerous." He laughed gently. The man's broken, but she didn't believe in broken men, only waiting ones. That August, letters from the East began arriving thick with talk of secession. The South buzzed with the fever of a coming storm. Men talked war in barbershops and churchyards, sharpening their pride like blades. The future that had once seemed secure now trembled on the edge of madness. For Beaumont, war promised profit. Horses would be worth gold if fighting came. For Delilah, it promised chaos, the kind of lawless space where grudges took root again. She wanted to leave Texas entirely, move east where her name meant nothing. But Beaumont loved the land, the open sky, the sound of hooves echoing against red clay. "We built this from ash," he told her. "I'm not running from ghosts." In October, the first real sign came that the ghosts weren't done. Curtis returned late from Palestine one night, pale and shaken. He'd seen Garrett at the saloon, thin, unshaven, eyes wild. He'd been drinking hard and talking louder, bragging about how some debts never go unpaid. When Curtis passed, Garrett had called after him, slurring a promise. "Tell your master the trade ain't over yet." Beaumont dismissed it as drunken talk, but Delilah didn't sleep that night. She kept the shotgun near the window and watched the horizon until dawn. 2 weeks later, it happened. A warm wind blew through that evening, the smell of rain thick in the air. The horses were restless, stamping and whinnying against their stalls. Delilah was writing at her desk when Abraham burst through the door. "Ride us," he said. Coming fast, she was outside before Beaumont reached the porch. 3 figures, maybe 4, riding hard down the road, lanterns swinging, dust rising behind them. She felt her heart drop. She knew the lead rider's posture even before his face caught the light. Garrett. Beaumont stepped forward, rifle in hand, voice calm but edged. "You should have stayed gone." Garrett dismounted. His coat hung loose, eyes bloodshot, a pistol already drawn. Rain began to fall in thick, slow drops, darkening the dust between them. "You took everything from me," he said, voice shaking with liquor and rage. "My name, my wife, my peace." Delilah stood behind Beaumont, one hand on the shotgun, the other on the rail to steady herself. Garrett's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. The storm cracked open above them. Beaumont didn't raise his rifle. "You burned my barn, poisoned my stock, dragged my name through the court. I didn't take anything that wasn't already yours to lose." For a moment, lightning lit them both, two men bound by pride, one stripped of it, the other tempered by it. Garrett's gun fired first. The shot echoed like the sky splitting. Beaumont staggered back, hit low, falling against the porch post. Delilah screamed, leveled her shotgun, and fired both barrels at once. The nearest rider toppled from his horse. Garrett turned toward her, face twisted in disbelief that she'd fight. She reloaded with shaking hands as he raised his pistol again. The second blast struck him square in the chest. He fell to his knees, gun slipping from his hand, mouth working soundlessly. Then he pitched forward into the mud. The storm broke fully then, rain hammering, thunder rolling across the fields, the air thick with gunpowder and smoke. Abraham and the Yarrows dragged Beaumont inside, blood soaking his shirt, Delilah pressing her hands against the wound as if sheer will could hold him together. He lasted until dawn. Long enough to whisper something she never repeated. Long enough for her to know he hadn't died with hate in him. When he went still, she sat beside him until the first light crept through the window, painting his face pale gold. By midday, the sheriff arrived. The story was simple and true enough. Trespassers attacked, shots fired in defense. Garrett's men had fled. One lay dead, another wounded and captured. The law, tired of the feud, called it finished. But the quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was aftermath. She buried Beaumont beside the barn he'd rebuilt, under a live oak whose roots ran deep. Garrett's body went back to his estate, where no wife or family claimed it. The Morgan stallion, once his pride, roamed riderless until a hand from town took it away. For months after, people came by the farm to buy horses or offer condolences. Some came out of curiosity, to see the woman who had outlasted both men. She met them all with the same calm, collected manner, her grief hidden behind the steady rhythm of work. When war finally came the next spring, she sold the operation to Curtis and Abraham, dividing the profits equally. She left Texas quietly, heading east with a single trunk and the locked chest of papers that still carried Garrett's secrets. No one knew where she went. Years later, travelers passing through Palestine told stories about a woman who once traded her husband's shame for her own freedom, who turned a scandal into a business, a curse into survival. Some said she'd died in Louisiana, others that she'd remarried in Missouri under another name. No one ever proved which was true, but in Anderson County, the tale never really died. People still point to the field where the old barn once stood and say you can hear hoofbeats there on storm nights. Steady, distant, like a man and a woman riding side by side through rain, refusing to stop. And in the courthouse archives, the original papers still sit, brittle and yellow, sealed under glass. September 14th, 1858, transaction of transfer between James H. Garrett and Silas Beaumont. No one ever quite agrees what it meant, sin, justice, or something stranger. But every reader feels it the same way. The heat of pride, the weight of cruelty, and the echo of a bargain that outlived them all. Because some trades don't end when the ink dries. They just keep riding on, through history, through rumor, through the dark heart of Texas itself.